And we also talk about what you can do if grass-fed, grass-finished beef is not in your budget. Studies have shown that grass-fed, grass-finished beef has significantly more vitamin A and E. So the idea or the goal of grain finishing really is to increase the weight as much as possible, and part of that is because it increases also the fat content within the muscle meat. So that goes more into the regenerative aspect, where you regenerate, the soil quality and improve soil quality. For one is, make sure, that meat has not seen any antibiotics. Freeze-dried options. One of the reasons we started with MK supplements is to bridge those gaps that you might not be able to bridge because of financial reasons or whatever the case might be. Invest in a slow cooker. Costs you, $50, but $5 for a pound of ground meat. That's at the level of conventionally raised meat, So
you're listening to the Primal Shift podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kummer, and my goal is to help you achieve optimal health by bridging the gap between ancestral living and the demands of modern society. Get ready to unlock the transformative power of nature as the ultimate biohack, revolutionizing your health and reconnecting you with your primal self.
Before we continue, I'd like to thank a company who helped me improve my cardiorespiratory fitness, or VO2 max, by 37% in just a few weeks. All it took was 3 9-minute workouts per week. That's less than 30 minutes of exercise per week. Of course, I'm talking about Calorie, my favorite reheat bike that I've been using for over 3 years. Reheat stands for Reduced Exertion High Intensity Interval Training, and it's a scientifically proven training methodology that helps you squeeze the most benefits out of a workout in the shortest amount of time. Each workout on Calorie takes as little as 5 minutes and provides the same benefits as a 45-minute run. Don't believe me? Check out my detailed Calorie reviews on my blog and YouTube channel, links in the show notes. But if I'm too busy to go to the gym as your main excuse not to exercise, check out the Calorie Bike and use code Michael to get $100 off on carolbike.com. That's carolbike.com. Now back to the episode. Grass-fed versus grain-fed beef. What's better? Or more specifically, what's more nutritious? And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode of the Primal Shift podcast. We'll also define some of those terms because there's a lot of confusing and misleading language floating around on the internet as well as in grocery stores. And we also talk about what you can do if grass-fed, grass-finished beef is not in your budget. Is it better to not have beef at all? Or are there maybe, alternatives that you can pick from to get most of the benefits? Now let's start with some terminology, and specifically with the term grass-fed beef, because grass-fed beef, in reality doesn't really mean anything. And that's because all cows, for the majority of their lives, are raised on grass, or at least are fed grass. Might be in a barn eating hay, but it's still grass. And only towards the end, some or the majority of cows in the conventional system are then finished on grain, whereas a smaller percentage remain on grass. And so the much better terminology to look for is really grass finished versus grain finished. Grass by itself doesn't really mean much, A calf that was just weaned from mama cannot eat grain without getting sick and ultimately probably dying, So most cows need to eat grass for a good portion of their life. That's just, how it is. So grass-fed, again, not a very meaningful term, that is. So let's talk about the benefits, and whenever, throughout the rest of this episode, if I say grass-fed, I really mean grass-finished, right? And if I say grain-fed, I mean grain-finished, just to make this the terminology clear. But studies have shown, and I'm going to link many of the resources down in the show notes and the description. Studies have shown that grass-fed, grass-finished beef has significantly more vitamin A and E than conventionally raised counterparts. We've also seen that grass-fed beef has up to 4 times more omega-3 fatty acids and a more favorable ratio between omega-6 and omega-3. For example, grass-fed meat has a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 of approximately 2-to-1. So there are twice as much omega-6 than omega-3 in the beef. Whereas conventionally raised beef has a ratio of 9-to-1. So 9 times more omega-6 than omega-3. And that is important because, first of all, too many PUFAs, too many polyunsaturated fatty acids are problematic and not necessarily good for your health. But in particular, if you have significantly more of the omega-6s, that's a bad thing because they are pro-inflammatory above certain amounts. Now, the good news is beef overall has relatively low amounts of PUFAs in general. So yes, there is a discrepancy between grass-fed and grass-finished and grain-finished beef. But since the total amounts are relatively low, that is probably one of the things that I wouldn't sweat too much about, Now, the other thing that we have seen is grass-fed beef has twice as much conjugated linoleic acid. So again, from a fatty acid profile perspective, grass-fed beef is clearly the better choice. Now, it's not only the fats that are different, and that's something that I just recently learned, but also the amino acid composition or the amounts of amino acids, the amino acid content in grass-fed, grass-finished beef is up to 76% better or has a higher amino acid content than grain-finished beef. That's interesting because one of the reasons I consume beef predominantly is because of the protein, fat as well, but mostly the protein. Studies have also shown that grass-fed, grass-finished beef has up to 64% more antioxidants and phytochemicals like glutathione and superoxide dismutase. And that's interesting because a lot of the folks that who follow a plant-based diet argue that they do that because of the phytochemicals in plants. And it's true that some of those phytochemicals have anti-carcinogenic and cardiovascular protective properties. So they can potentially reduce the risk of developing cancer and protect the cardiovascular system. And that's why a lot of people follow plant-based diets because of those phytochemicals that help, protect against those issues. Now, here's the thing. If you've been following me for a while, you also know that plants also have a ton of chemicals that are not good for your health. Anti-nutrients, phytoestrogens, etc. And so consuming plants to get phytochemicals that might be good for you while still getting a bunch of chemicals that are bad for you is not really a smart idea. Instead, you can consume well-raised meat or meat from well-raised animals to get the same phytochemicals without any of the issues, without any of the downsides of consuming plants. So that's something that's worth considering. The other thing with grass-finished beef is it's typically lower in calories because it has less fat. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily an advantage just because it has fewer calories. I don't mind calories, especially not if they come from meat, from fat and protein of animal-based sources. But the reason why it has less fat is because, if you finish a cow on grains, the meat becomes more marbled. That, one could argue improves the flavor. But it really means that, the cow is getting fat and obese, So the idea or the goal of grain finishing really is to increase the weight as much as possible. And part of that is because it increases also the fat content within the muscle meat. And so you get that marbling, but it really means you're already getting to stages of, metabolic dysfunction because a cow is not supposed to be that fat and grow that quickly in a short amount of time. Speaking of growing, and that's an important consideration, both from a consumer perspective as well as from a farmer's perspective. Grass finishing beef takes somewhere between 20 to 24 months. So up to 2 years to finish beef or to finish a cow on grass, on only pasture. Finishing a cow on grains takes 13 to 15 months. So it's significantly faster, almost twice as fast. And there are a couple of considerations. Obviously, from a farmer's perspective, the quicker you can slaughter the cow, the quicker you can make money. So it makes economic sense from a farming perspective, if you take the environmental factors and everything else, not into account. But from a nutrition perspective, from a consumer perspective, that's also relevant because if you think about it, if a cow can consume for almost a year longer plants that contain those phytochemicals and antioxidants and all of the things that the cow can then deposit in the meat that you end up eating, then it becomes relatively clear why that meat is more nutritious, because there is more of that stuff consumed by the cow that then ends up in the meat and ultimately in your body and in your stomach, The big downside of grass-fed, grass-finished meat is obviously the cost. It's more expensive. In some cases, significantly more expensive depending on, the cut you look at. Especially with steaks, grass-fed, grass-finished steak, ridiculously expensive and out of reach for a lot of people, and we'll talk about this. But there is another nuance to the discussion, and that is the difference between, so let's imagine, you have a huge paddock, acres and acres and acres of pasture, and you let a horde of cows out there, and they stay on that same paddock for all their life, for the whole 24 months, let's say. Now, here's the thing, all animals eat dessert first, meaning that they eat the most succulent plants, or the cows eat the most succulent plants first and leave everything, for someone else to eat. So their feed diversity is somewhat limited. Also, the way they disrupt the soil, that they work the soil, is also limited because they poop where they eat. And if they only eat in certain areas, because that's where the plants are growing that they like best, then they only deposit a lot of poop in that area, but maybe nothing in other areas. So from a soil quality perspective, just having one large pasture, regardless of how large the pasture is and how many cows you have, but it leads to fewer improvements in terms of soil quality, and ultimately also then to a less nutritious meat than if you were to regeneratively raise and rotationally graze the animal. And what that basically means is moving the animals from one paddock to another, in some cases even on a twice a day or on a daily basis, or within 3 days or so. But the idea really is that you give them just enough grass, enough feed, so they have to eat everything before they are moved on to the next paddock. And that means a much greater feed diversity. They consume a wider variety of plants because they need to eat everything to satisfy their appetite rather than just picking and choosing. It also leads to improved soil quality because they evenly distribute the manure and work that stuff into the soil with their hoofs, etc. So that goes more into the regenerative aspect, where you regenerate, the soil quality and improve soil quality. And that also leads then to a better nutritional profile of the meat. So there are really 3 categories if you look at it. There is conventionally raised, there is, grass-fed, grass-finished, and then there is grass-fed, grass-finished, but also with the regenerative rotational grazing aspect taken into account. And those 3 categories really lead to different nutritional profiles. Now, what I've mentioned before in terms of all of the more vitamin A and E and antioxidants, etc., that applies to the combination of grass-fed, grass-finished as well as regenerative. But you can get even more, or you're at the higher end of those numbers, if you buy meat from cows that have been regeneratively raised, right? So there is definitely a difference in micro and macronutrients between those different types of beef. Now, what if you can't afford, grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised, the top-of-the-line beef? I mean, if you go to Whole Foods or whatever and you look at at the highest quality steak they sell, or even go to a local farm, and get a couple of ribeyes, it's ridiculously expensive, So the question is, what do you do if you can't do that? If all you can afford is, the beef they sell at Costco, the regular conventionally raised, grain-finished, USDA choice beef, is that better, or is it better to not eat beef at all if that's the only option? And I would argue that any beef, with some exceptions, is better than no beef. So my recommendation is to purchase the best meat you can afford. For some, that's grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised, the whole 9 yards. For some, it's, the meat from Costco or from other places. Doesn't really matter. Now, there are a few things that I would look out for. One is, make sure, that meat has not seen any antibiotics, And the truth is that most brands now, regardless of what grocery store you go to, they've all realized that consumers don't want to buy beef that where the cow has been exposed to antibiotics. So that's one thing. Then there are obviously certain vaccines, mRNA, etc., that are now getting into the picture. I would recommend trying to stick with meats that have not been exposed to those chemicals, to those pharmaceuticals. And that applies really to most of the meat, or a lot of the meat that you can find in stores. So that's number one. Buy the best meat you can afford. The difference in nutrients does exist, absolutely, but you can potentially make that up with then buying pastured eggs from your local farmer or from the store. You can maybe make that up by consuming organ meats, which are typically less expensive cuts of the animal that you can find for significantly less than a ribeye. Organ meats, great source of micronutrients and many of those phytochemicals and other things that you would get from the muscle meat as well. Freeze-dried options. One of the reasons we started with MK supplements is to bridge those gaps that you might not be able to bridge because of financial reasons or whatever the case might be. So you can mitigate a lot of that if you cannot afford the best type of meat. The other thing is stick to less expensive cuts. There is no need from a nutritional perspective to eat ribeye every day, or steak in general every day. You can make roasts. You can, buy organ meats. With roasts in particular and some of the potentially, tougher cuts, but also much less expensive cuts, you throw them in a slow cooker. Invest in a slow cooker. Costs you, $50, once. And every type of meat you can throw in a slow cooker comes out tender and soft and not chewy at all. So that would be my recommendation. Buy roasts. Even ground meat is usually significantly less expensive than a steak or some of the other cuts. There are grocery stores like Aldi and Walmart, and I have separate videos on that I can link to in the show notes, that offer grass-fed, grass-finished meat for a reasonable price. Yes, some of it comes from New Zealand. It might come from Argentina. Some of it, I think in the case of Walmart, if I remember correctly, it's actually domestic meat, So you can get that at a very reasonable price, often half, of what you would pay for at other places. And in some cases, just to give you the example of the ground meat at Aldi and Walmart, it costs like $5 here in Georgia. It might be different in California and other places, but $5 for a pound of ground meat, that's at the level of conventionally raised meat, So it gets very close. It might be still a little bit more expensive, but very, very doable, And again, not eating meat or eating meat alternatives, be it lab-grown or, plant-based meat or whatever, is certainly worse than just buying regular conventionally raised meat in the store at Costco or whatever. The other thing you can do is, at Costco to a degree, buy in bulk, right? That's one of the reasons Costco exists. But what I really mean by that is you can find a quarter, half, or even an entire cow. There are farms, usually, here in Georgia, there are farms around us. There are places online where you can order a quarter of a cow, half a cow, or an entire cow and get the meat at a discounted price. Instead of buying, 3 pounds per week or whatever, you buy, 80, 200, 400 pounds of meat and you get it at a discount. And that's usually what we do. Up until now, we've been buying an entire cow each year from a local farm here. And that drops the average price approximately to, I think, $9, $10, $11 a pound, across, all the different cuts. That's very reasonable, or at least significantly more reasonable if we were to buy, the individual cuts in the store. Now, last but not least, that's not really something you can do quickly, or it might not even be initially more inexpensive. But consider, at some point, buying some land and raising your own animals, because at the end of the day, what does a cow need? Grass, so that means you need water from rain, ideally, and sunshine. Those things are typically free. You obviously need to invest in the land initially. You need fencing, and that's pretty much what your cow needs, and time, obviously, your time, to move the cow from pasture to pasture every day, and to get the best meat possible. And that's one of the things that's exactly what we are doing here at the Kummer Homestead. Not yet with cattle because we don't have the space, but starting with next year or 2026, we'll be raising our own cows for exactly that reason. And that really sums it up. So the bottom line is, yes, grass-fed, grass-finished meat is nutritionally superior over conventionally raised, grain-finished beef. But the differences are not big enough for you to say, you know what, if I can't have the grass-fed, grass-finished, or I can't afford it, I'm going to eat something else. Something else is definitely not better than conventionally raised meat. So think about that. Obviously, take, animal welfare, environmental factors, all of the things into account. But at the end of the day, if you need to feed yourself to maintain optimal health, do what you can, buy the best you can, and don't worry about the rest. I hope you like this episode, and I hope I'll see you in the next one.